The question is the new Grand Seiko Cherry Blossom overrated? Let's find out. Welcome back to Time on the Wrist at Chisholm Hunter. My name is Harrison as always, and today we have the Grand Seiko Cherry Blossom. This thing is beautiful, but we'll be taking a deeper dive into it and seeing if it's overrated. The obvious thing that everybody loves about Grand Seiko is of course the dials, because they're leaps and bounds ahead of pretty much every single other brand in the luxury watch industry. But I don't think it's fair to start with the dial. I think we can't judge a book by its cover. Let's get to know this watch a bit more intimately before we get up close and personal with the dial. So the specs of this model, it comes in at 40 millimeters in diameter, which is pretty perfect for my wrists. My wrists come in at about 6.5 inches. They're a little bit more on the skinny side. This is the perfect dress watch measurement for me. The lug to lug comes in at 47 millimeters, and the thickness, let's find out. So the thickness of this model comes in at 12.8 millimeters according to our tools just here, our caliper. And that's actually quite thick for a dress watch. And let me explain this a bit further. It actually has boxed domed sapphire crystal glass. So when you look at it from an angle, the sapphire crystal is actually raised and it adds that little bit extra depth. I'm not sure how I feel about this, and neither is Drew. I just feel like, why would you add extra glass between it and the dial? Because the dial is one of the most attractive features of the watch. It's not a bad thing, it's just not particularly my style. What do you think? However, on that note, I can understand why Grand Seiko have done this. If you look at traditional dress watches, they pretty much all have domed sapphire crystal glass. It's a very traditional dressy feature. But on that note, I'm quite clumsy, so I think that I would probably by accident give this a knock, and that's why I prefer the sapphire crystal glass that sits closer to the dial. So it's not for me, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong. The case and the bracelet are made entirely from titanium. Now, titanium is obviously harder wearing than steel and is that little bit darker. I'm gonna say this because it's true. This case and this bracelet are stunning. They've used a combination of brushed and Zaratsu polished finishing, and this is what makes a Grand Seiko a Grand Seiko. It is the finishing, it is the little tiny details that they've really focused in on. It is beautiful. The high intensity titanium that they've used is, of course, that bit darker, as I've mentioned earlier. But what I love about this is when Grand Seiko use those textured dials, which they spend such a long time perfecting, it makes it pop out that little bit more. I feel like when you have polished steel, the polished white steel kind of steals the show. It takes it away from the dial. But in the titanium, it doesn't do that because it's that little bit more dulled down. This is why I bought a Grand Seiko. This is why I literally went out of my own money and purchased one, because of the case and the dial and the way it plays with each other and the sharp edges and the finishing. You guys can tell that I'm a fan of this because it's just stunning. The bracelet on this watch is obviously a combination of brushed titanium and the center link, or the outsides of the center link in two lines going down the bracelet are the Zaratsu polishing. It gives a really, really nice design in contrast with the dial wonderfully. Most of the dial itself, or the case itself, is polished, and it has those sharp edges that Grand Seiko fans just absolutely adore. Then you have the deployment clasp, which feels really, really nice, really sturdy, and I like this on the wrist. It's not, I would never change this to a rubber strap or a NATO strap or whatever it is. I do feel that Grand Seiko bracelets don't need to be changed ever because they just fit the watch perfectly. There's nothing that I could add to this watch to make it better. Grand Seiko have nailed it from the starting block. Moving on to the crown, it actually has a really, really nice resistance to it. I'm turning it at the moment, and it's really satisfying to know that that's powering that beautiful spring drive movement that we'll come on to in a second. It merges really, really nicely with the actual case itself. It's not too prominent, so it doesn't dig into the rest. I've said this in a couple of reviews. When sports watches in particular have those big crown guards and big crowns, they're too intrusive. They seem to kind of dig into your wrist when you're bending it. This doesn't do that. It's sort of a very dressy style, and it is address watch. Let's get to the weight of this model, and then let's compare it to the Tudor Black Bay in steel that I have at the moment. It's not comparable, but I want to show you guys how lightweight titanium really is. This comes in at 100 grams. And my Tudor Black Bay, which is totally in steel, I've taken a couple of links out of the bracelet, but apart from that, it's pretty set. It's the ETA version. Comes in at 161 grams. That is 61 grams heavier than the Grand Seiko, even though I've taken links out of the Tudor. One thing that I totally forgot to mention is that on the underbelly of the sapphire crystal glass, it actually has anti-reflective coating. This gives it a really nice sheen when kind of reflecting it into the light. As usual guys, this dial will look better in person. It was actually quite difficult to film and retain all that beautiful detail. Drew spent a very long time filming this and trying to retain all that detail. But where you can see this detail is on the Chisholm Hunter website or in one of our 29 stores throughout the UK. So make sure you visit the website, link below. The movement in this model is the NR65 and it is visible through the open caseback and it is gorgeous. It's a spring drive movement, and I know that we've gone over what spring drive movements are before, and I'll link it up here for you if you want to sort of get a deeper understanding, but basically they're hybrid engines. They've got both electric and also mechanical parts to them. This movement can hold 72 hours of power and is accurate to 1 second a day. I'll say that again because that is incredible. 1 second a day, that is nuts. For those of you that are in the watch industry, you'll know how accurate that is. It has 30 joules and this beautiful movement is visible through the open caseback. But one thing that I'm maybe not as big a fan on is the Grand Seiko Spring Drive logo on the back of the case, the golden line that you can see in the back here. I prefer cleaner case backs that I can see straight into the beautiful movement because this is a beautiful movement. So it's just a personal thing, but I don't like that distraction of something taking away of the intricacies of the watch. It's funny, literally as we are speaking right now, and we'll flip this over and get to the dial at the moment, but as we are speaking right now, I've had 2 messages on the Chisholm Hunter watches page asking what model this is. So this is the Cherry Blossom. It's featured on the Chisholm Hunter website at the moment. If you want to follow our Chisholm Hunter watches page, I'll see you there. Getting straight into the dial, which is, I'm gonna say this is probably the crux of the watch purchase because it's unbelievably beautiful. But I'm gonna tell a story here. So when sakura flowers in Japan hit the water, they kind of swirl and float and they make a really nice texture. Now the Japanese call this flower rafts. And this dial is a representation of the flower rafts. It's like a really light pink with beautiful textures running through it. So let's get into more detail. The hands on the dial are the classic Grand Seiko, well, hands and indices actually, that have that Zuratsu polishing that are highly, highly reflective and contrast wonderfully with the dial. To be honest, the hands and the indices on Grand Seikos are some of my favorite in the watch industry as a whole. I just think they're so slender, so sleek, and so subtle. I really am a fan of them. This dial has the date window at 3 o'clock and the power reserve function at about the 7 to the 8 mark, probably about the half 7 mark. And I love the fact that it has these 2 features. The date window isn't too small or too big, it's perfectly sized. However, being me, I would like that in the middle. I would like it at the 6 o'clock mark, and I would like to move that power reserve up to the left or over to where the date window is at the moment. This is just personal preference. However, it actually does kind of balance itself out because they're on opposite sides. So, I don't know, personal preference, what would you prefer? The Grand Seiko logo is positioned below the 12 o'clock mark and the GS is in gold and it's slightly raised. And it actually contrasts really, really nicely with the dial. Sometimes when you put gold on something that's maybe white, it doesn't really have that aesthetic appeal, but this really, really does. Then you have the black text below that in the Grand Seiko and the iconic Grand Seiko font, which looks brilliant and adds that depth because it's slightly lowered. And then below that at the 6 o'clock mark, you have the spring drive, and that's what this is. It's a spring drive movement. Let's get into that dial detail then. So we know that the dial is a really, really light shade of pink, and it looks really nice. It's almost like a metallic-y pink, and then it's obviously textured with the beautiful patterns running through it. This dial seems to amalgamate into so many different things when you play in the light. And no matter how many wrist shots I get, no matter how many macro shots we get, no matter where we take this, I'll never be able to do it justice. This dial and this watch demands to be respected and worn. not looked at from afar. Online, you will never see the beauty of this watch. I urge you to try this on because I'm a huge fan. But the question was, at the end of the day, is this watch overrated? And the answer is no. And let me explain why. When you look at a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, whether it's a car, whether it's a piece of jewelry, whether it's a watch, whether it's a piece of art, you need to see it and feel it in person in order to appreciate the artist's design, what they've done with that piece of craftsmanship. You wouldn't look at the Mona Lisa through a screen and say, oh, it's all right. You'd go and see it in person because it's the Mona Lisa and the art is just incredible. It's a piece of history. When you look at this watch, people judge it on a picture. That's not right. You need to see it in person in order to get the full impact of what Grand Seiko have done here, and what they've done here is nothing short of miraculous. I have answered my question, but now I want you to answer a question of mine. Would you prefer this or the Snowflake? Let me know in the comments. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Time on the Wrist at Chisholm Hunter. My name is Harrison as usual, and make sure you click this subscribe button to join the Chisholm Hunter family. I will see you next time.